Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about Netflix and very little else. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we are talking about the Netflix adaptation of the classic video game series Castlevania. This is an animated series written by the beloved by me comics writer Warren Ellis. And we're also talking about the Netflix true crime documentary / reality show Tiger King, about the petty grievances, betrayals and eventually crimey murders or crimey attempted murders in the big cat owning community over in America. But before all of those Netflix things, Alistair, what else have you been consuming and was it on Netflix?
No, actually,
Oh shit.
No, weirdly, I have been watching a lot of Netflix, but mainly Tiger King and Castlevania, as I'd fallen behind on Castlevania, so I had to catch up rapidly. So I've done the whole thing in quite a short space of time. But other than that, for the second of my lockdown culture updates, I've been revisiting something that was recommended in a previous What Have You Been Doing Recently / recommendation section, which is something that you recommended while I've been reading Doom Patrol. I think it's an 80s run that was written by Grant Morrison and drawn by Richard Case and John Nyberg.
Late 80s, I think. Late 80s, maybe early 90s. That sort of grimy Vertigo Sandman era. Yeah.
So I've been reading some Doom Patrol comics from that. Yeah, which you recommended. I've read 2 volumes, which I think have about sort of 6 issues in each of them. Crawling from the Wreck, which I think was the first one that Grant Morrison wrote.
Yeah.
And then the second one, which is The Painting That Ate Paris. Are these are classic Doom Patrol stories? Would we go that far?
Yes, these are widely beloved. Before Grant Morrison took over, they were kind of seen as a bit of a sort of mid-list team who were mostly, I think, seen as DC's slight rip-off of the X-Men with their wheelchair-bound mentor. But yeah, when Grant Morrison took over, this sort of slightly surreal, knowing weirdness thing very much became their main raison d'etre.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's what I really liked about it, how sort of odd and offbeat it is. Like the first adventure, Crawling from the Wreck, involves these sort of paper creatures from another dimension kind of bleeding through to ours and with these giant scissors and kind of cutting people up. But like cutting them up like they're made of paper, it's one of those things that, like, it works really well, sort of drawn in the kind of slightly flat, cel-shaded comic book style, so that, like, it's kind of unreal enough that you can kind of believe that that's a person and that's a weird paper thing, and it's coming to get them, and it's quite menacing. And then the second one is really interesting, the Painting That Ate Paris. Yeah, about, well, funnily enough, a painting that kind of sucks all of Paris into it. And the Doom Patrol have to go in to find out what's going on. And it's full of references to, like, art movements from the early 20th century that were based primarily around Paris. So there's lots of stuff about Dada, surrealism, impressionism, things like that. So as someone who's interested in that period of art history, the sort of late 19th century, early 20th century modernism, there was a lot of nods and sort of things that I really appreciated, including like how they sort of changed the kind of style of the comic as they traveled through different bits of the painting to kind of reflect the different art styles and art movements, which I thought was very well done.
Yeah, it is a bit of a rote thing to say about comics at this point, I think, but the idea that you can draw literally anything and it would probably come across as silly or weird if you tried to do it in live action, but in comics, or maybe I guess also in animation, this sort of sudden leap into weirdness or two-dimensional beings that exist only as a concept or flying through a painting or something you can just sort of jump into. And yeah, Grant Morrison and the weirder end of his run is, well, his work as a whole is particularly good for that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, there's lots of quite highbrow art stuff, which I quite like, and there's some great writing as well. They've got sort of a good core cast of characters. I mean, it starts by introducing or reintroducing the Doom Patrol in Crawling from the Wreck, so I think it's a good place to begin, as it kind of introduces certainly the core sort of 3 characters. There's Cliff, Crazy Jane, and Rebus.
Yeah. Elastigirl wasn't in it at that point, was she?
I don't think she was. So. No, there's a few other supporting characters who I think they might go into more in the future. It's a sort of interesting cast of bizarre villains, including like Mr. Nobody, who's a sort of Dada collage character. I thought was quite good, quite scary. And again, sort of those odd things that really could only work in like a comic.
Yeah, and when Grant Morrison took over, he kind of moved on a bit from treating them like the X-Men and started treating them a bit more like people who had dealt with disabilities and trauma and started really focusing more on that as their unique character angle, which again is one of his other big contributions to the property.
Yeah, like the Crawling from the Wreck begins with the Cliff character being in like a car crash, and then he wakes up in a sort of, he's just a brain in a metal body, which is, yeah, there's something quite sort of disturbing about that. There's definitely like sort of a nightmare of being in an accident and waking up being able to feel or smell or you know, taste anything. Yeah, and it kind of handles his resulting sort of depression and suicidal tendencies quite well. There's a character also called Crazy Jane, who's quite interesting, although I must say the name Crazy Jane is very un-PC. It's not really how we refer to people with mental health problems anymore.
Yeah, Crazy Jane is probably a little bit, at times, a bit of a portrayal of mental illness from 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, and she's an interesting character. There's a good one in one of the later stories in the second volume when the Cliff character has to go sort of inside her brain, and the way it's sort of depicted of all, she's got DPD, dissociative personality disorder, and all the different personalities are kind of laid out like a subway network, and there's like a train that kind of connects them up, and then each station kind of is in the kind of the mold or reflects each kind of one of her sort of many personalities or her dissociated personalities. Yeah, so and I thought that was just a really interesting way to visually portray something like that. So yeah, the art is brilliant. Yeah, I do like the writing a lot, but yeah, I guess it must be say the way that Richard Chase and John Nyberg have kind of brought this sort of bizarre vision to life is really very impressive.
Yeah, I remember, yeah, it's a nice sort of touch of, I don't know, I want to say slightly grounded surrealism. Like, he plays the weird stuff quite straight rather than launching into some sort of aggressive wackiness, and it's quite effective.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Yeah, that's a good way of summarising it.
Yeah, I think as Doom Patrol's gone on, it has suffered a bit from subsequent writers just coming on and playing their little Grant Morrison tribute act. It is one of these properties that's been quite defined by this one era with this one very definitive voice. But the Grant Morrison stuff itself, which went for 6 books, I think, is really, really good.
Yeah. I highly recommend reading it. And like I say, it's a good place to start with Crawling from the Wreck because it kind of introduces all the main characters. It doesn't require any prior knowledge. So yeah, I believe there's a Doom Patrol TV show now on Stars Play.
Or just DC Universe if you're lucky enough to be in America.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's meant to be alright, actually. I've heard broadly good things about the Doom Patrol show. I will one day cough up for Stars Play so I can watch maybe that and Veronica Mars Season 4. One day.
Yeah, but I'd recommend that.
Did you watch Umbrella Academy in the end, or was that just me?
I watched the first episode, and I did like it. I thought it was very good. Is that another similar? That's another Grant Morrison, is it?
It's not written by Grant Morrison. It's just seen as being very Morrisonian, I suppose. It's if you read any critical analysis of Umbrella Academy, the first or second line will normally be heavily influenced by Morrison's Doom Patrol.
It's just one of those things I need to go back to. It's on the list, like things like the OA and stuff that I need to go back to at some point. Despite the fact that we're indoors, can't go outside, have nothing to do apart from watch TV, there's still a lot of TV to get through.
Well, you did, I believe, have to do 2 seasons of Castlevania this fortnight, so you know.
And 1 season of Tiger King.
Oh yeah, and that.
Anyway, enough about me. Nick, what have you been up to during the lockdown?
I have gone back to actually another former podcast subject, kind of. I watched the Red Dwarf special that aired, I think, a couple of weeks ago as of this recording, and probably even further in the past by the time we released this. But yeah, Red Dwarf, The Promised Land, the feature-length movie special that aired over the Easter weekend, in which they pull on a plot thread that they've been ignoring for an impressively long time, considering how long Red Dwarf has been about, and have some of the cat's people come back and fight the Red Dwarf crew, basically. Well, they come back because they think Lister's the Messiah, and therefore, as is often the case in, religious conflict, some of them want to worship him and others of them want to kill him, and things escalate from there. And yeah, it's pretty good. Red Dwarf is arguably kind of critic-proof at this point, which is why you could say, but Nick, why did you bring it up on this review podcast then? But yeah, it's basically, it's nice that they're still doing it. It's fun. It gives you an enjoyable twinge of nostalgia. It's probably doesn't come close to being something you'd actually say this is actively good. You should watch it even if you're not a Red Dwarf fan. But this is one of the better Dave ones, I think. Since Doug Naylor, the current writer, took it over on his own, which has been a few years ago now. I think we've now had more episodes with just him than with his old co-writer. I think he's wanted to do sort of more, maybe serious is the wrong word, but more involved sci-fi concepts and more sort of actually digging into the sci-fi. And I think that's occasionally had to fight for space a bit with the actual jokes. And the upside of doing like an hour-and-a-half movie is he does actually have time to do both reasonably satisfyingly. There are some jokes that don't quite land. This is, again, kind of a well-done review. Some of the humour seems a bit dated at times. Some of them, there's a bit towards the beginning where they say they've found Holly's backup disc, because one of the fun things they're doing for us in this one is bringing back Norman Lovett as Holly, the sort of ship's computer. They say they found it, and then they carry out this like massive floppy disk, like old school floppy disk, one of the old ones, but some people listening to this may not even fully know what they are, except as the save button in Microsoft Word. And yeah, it's huge. It's like the size of 2 people, and that's it. It's just a big floppy disk, and everyone in the live studio audience has a meltdown and applauds. And I sort of sat there going, well, okay, it's a big floppy disk.
Yep.
I see what you've done there. But yeah, especially towards the second half, they do actually get into some lore stuff and some surprisingly good, like, emotional stuff between Rimmer and Lister, where they are almost forced to admit they may actually like each other in a sort of high-stakes, death might be imminent moment.
Oh wow, that has been a long time coming in Red Dwarf. Yeah, the grudging acknowledgement that there is a reason why they've stuck together through all this. Yeah,
Yeah, they keep the sort of sniping going through most of the episode, and they cleverly hold this back until quite close to the end, and when things are looking pretty dire. It's actually quite cathartic when it comes, and there's some interesting moments of Rimmer having a genuine existential, hang on, am I just a simulation of a person? Do I actually exist moments, which are quite weird as well. So yeah, it's got some moments, it's got some good bits of nostalgia. Holly gets some good lines. They've managed to put out enough sort of emotional catharsis to make it feel like a real movie rather than just another sitcom episode. As ever, it's probably very much fans only, but if you're a fan who's not bothered watching it for a few seasons, it's worth an hour and a half. There's basically no continuity anymore.
that's a plot thread from like the first season when Lister emerges from the stasis chamber and discovers that there's a civilization that descended from his pet cat. Yeah, and then they never really go back to that. I always thought, like, I guess when I watched Red Dwarf, like as a sort of teenager, the sci-fi fan in me was very much like, but what happened to that civilization? Where are they? Why haven't they made contact with them? And then obviously you had to realize that it's a sitcom. They're not trying to build a coherent sci-fi universe. They're just trying to pivot towards what is the best joke.
Yeah, I know, but I too am surprised it's taken them 12 series and this movie to get back to the cat people, but the cat people are finally back. It is possible that this thread is finally being tugged on because the end is finally nigh for Red Dwarf. It does start to get the feeling like they may be getting a bit towards the end of their time with it, but to be honest, it's amazing they're still going at all. So
Yeah, we had a long hiatus, and then before it came back, I suppose, after the kind of terrible late 90s.
after the unsuccessful prison season, yeah.
Yeah, and then there was that was the last one the BBC did, is it? Then Dave resurrected it with the Back to Earth one, which was also terrible. But then I remember we covered it for a podcast a few years ago, and was pleased that they discovered that they had sort of found a way to do the humour again and make it sort of work.
They've basically gone for a hardcore, back-to-basic sitcom approach in that it's just about these four guys wandering around space.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
There's no continuity, really, episode to episode at all anymore. There's no attempt to really dig into the lore extensively, apart from, I think there was one episode where they dug into Rimmer's history a little. But yeah, it's basically just... It sometimes feels a bit retrograde, but it worked just about.
Yeah, I think the thing you got to think about Red Dwarf is that Red Dwarf is basically a workplace sitcom. It's not supposed to be like a sci-fi show. It's basically, it's like annoying colleagues sniping at each other with this like kind of level of sci-fi surrealism added onto it. So the fact they could have like, I don't know, creatures that bring your worst nightmare to life, or simulations and things like that. But yeah, it is very much, I think, in the mold of like workplace sitcoms as opposed to sci-fi shows.
I mean, to be honest, considering the years where they had the tightest arcs were the 2 years when they did that prison storyline, which didn't really work. So I can't really say there's a strong argument for tight story arcs on Red Dwarf. I feel like, yes, they probably do have to live in the sitcom stuff to some degree. And, again, this stands alone nicely. The status quo is there at the beginning and it's there at the end, so it doesn't look like they're deviating from that.
Yep, works for them. First up this episode, we will be reviewing Castlevania, created by Warren Ellis. Previously, we reviewed the first series of this show, and now we're looking at series 2 and 3. In series 2, Dracula marshals an army of vampires to wipe out humanity, whilst his son, Alucard, Trevor Belmont, the last surviving member of a famous vampire hunting family, and Cypher, a travelling chronicler of stories and mage, seek to save humanity and kill Dracula. The third series deals with the fallout after this war. We've seen the whole show up to date, so Nick, what did you think of it?
Well, I watched series 2 about a year and a half ago when it aired, or when it was released or whatever. So my memory of that's a little spottier. But yeah, I watched series 3 over the last couple of weeks, and I really enjoyed it. Weirdly, this might be one of the shows that like most directly and specifically reminds me of Game of Thrones since Game of Thrones finished. It's something to do with partly there's the grimy, violent, sex, fantasy stuff, and partly it's the surprisingly talky, involved politics intrigue angle, which I didn't entirely see coming. Partly because that wasn't so much the case in season 1, and partly because it's a video game adaptation and they're not often known for their overly talky intrigue approach to storytelling. They tend to be a lot more focused on violence, again, like season 1 was. Not that season 1 was bad, but it was very much a sort of action movie scenario with some well-written quips and some nicely choreographed violence. But yeah, in season 2 and 3, he goes really into a sort of slightly slower, more novelistic premium telly approach, and I for the most part really enjoyed it. It sometimes cusps on being too slow, but I do think there are some nicely written conversations they're having at great length. And yeah, there was a surprising amount of digging into the politics of both sides, both the goodies and the air quotes baddies, and the sort of interaction between them. And yeah, yeah, I always quite enjoy when it's done well. This sort of, the big baddie's been defeated, the plot's basically over, what do we do now stories. I mean, they can go horribly wrong, because sometimes the answer actually is, nothing, mate, you should have stopped it when the plot finished. Others may disagree, but so far I think they've done a good job of justifying continuing.
Yeah, I think the Game of Thrones parallel is very apt in the sense that, like, also it's this kind of big sprawling story, but it begins with kind of something that's quite focused, such as Game of Thrones begins pretty much just with, you know, the story at King's Landing with, you know, Ned Stark being the Hand, and then things get scattered. We don't need to recap the plot of Game of Thrones. Whereas this begins kind of with two core storylines. There's kind of the story centered around Dracula and his plan to wage a war against humanity, and then the story focused around the three heroes who are trying to prevent him. By the end of the second into the third series, it's very much split out. They've introduced new characters who are sort of scattered all over the world, all on their own quests. And you get the sense that it is moving towards some kind of moment when they bring all these plot threads together. Yeah, they introduce some other characters, including one of Dracula's mages. They call them Forge Masters, who can summon evil spirits, called Isaac. He gets sent to the other side of the world and is kind of slowly making his way back to have revenge on the people who betrayed Dracula. The idea, there's a lot of plot threads, so we'll hopefully all come together. They're quite disparate at this point and sort of scattered all over the world. I did feel that I really liked the second series, which had this real sense of building towards this like epic conflict when you've got a war on one side and I was about to say people trying to stop the war, but the war's already begun. People trying to win it for one side and win it for the other, which then ends with series 2, and then there's this scattering that we mentioned. Series 3, I enjoyed it. I felt it was quite slow. It's gone to 10 episodes from 8. And maybe that was a bit of a mistake in that there's a lot of, you're right, there are some great conversations and like some really good written dialogue, and each episode is only 25 minutes, so they do just go by quite quickly. But in the third series, there's a large plot line when Trevor and Cypher are in this small village, and it kind of takes up most of the second series, and I kind of felt this could have moved faster. There's some creepy monks who clearly something bad has happened to them, and then they kind of spin it out for the whole series, and I felt I kind of know where this is going. It's sort of established quite early on that these creepy monks are evil, and there is more than just and they actually turned out to be evil. There's a bit more sort of subtlety and complexity to the plot, but I did feel it moved quite slowly. Maybe a sort of sense of pace kind of went out to it after they dispensed with this plot line of this like sort of epic conflict. But I don't know if they're maybe also like, again, if they're going for like sort of explosive start and then kind of slowing the pace down a bit while the characters are scattered to kind of gather them together and accelerate again. The first series is also very short, and I do really feel like the first and second series kind of really sit together as one.
Yeah, but I'm glad they've been renewed for Series 4, because, Series 3 definitely had the hanging sense of setup about it. Like, it would have been a tad frustrating if they'd been cancelled at the end of Season 3, having spent most of that series basically getting their plots in line for Season 4. Yeah,
or even beyond that. Yeah, I mean, Series 3 felt very much like a mid-series Game of Thrones. It's like, you see, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. You're broadening out the world, you're developing the characters, it's quite rich. Yeah, but at the same time, it's moving slowly towards its goal, and I'm kind of in, I really like the final episode. The plot seemed to take a step forwards. There was a substantial step forwards. And I like the fact that it is moving slowly towards something, but I do feel that like it is moving quite slowly, and after sitting through 8 series of Game of Thrones and then discovering that the something was a little bit underwhelming, I do feel there's a lesson to be learned here, which is maybe like zip along a bit faster.
Yeah, it does definitely feel like some of the mid-series Game of Thrones runs, which did focus more on spreading everyone apart and slowly doing some development, which does, as you say, kind of throw our expectations forward to, well, gee whiz, I sure hope this is all worth it.
Yeah.
Because, basically each episode was sort of structured. Basically, there was one scene for each of the major storylines per episode. I mean, it changes up a bit, I think, towards the end when they're starting to pick up the pace, but that's basically how a lot of them work.
The one, sometimes you'll get like one, there might be like one character's storyline that will like open and close the episode or something like that, so that you get like a bit more. Like the other Forge Master who's in prison in the third series.
Hector.
Yeah, there was like a few episodes in series 3 that he just wasn't in it at all, because his plot, again, didn't move very far in that series. Although, it had some interesting developments.
Yeah, and it introduces a whole new set of evil vampires, who I'm guessing will become even more an issue in Series 4. The Council of Sisters, the Carmilla character from Season 2, and her 3 associates.
Yeah, I get the feeling they're building them up as the primary villains. Yeah, which is interesting. They've dispensed with Dracula quite early.
There's the inevitable moment where they sort of tease Dracula coming back, but ultimately don't.
Which is interesting. But then again, they've left that thread open. Basically, they said like it is possible that Dracula can return by introducing a plotline in series 3 about a sort of interdimensional portal thing that among the places it could go to is hell, where they could bring Dracula back from the undead death. That actually, that scene with the interdimensional portal, I thought was amazing. There are some really, really good visuals in this show. Like the violence is very well choreographed, and there's some excellent action scenes. It is quite gory, but there is just some really, really like visually beautiful bits, like the bit when there's one of the characters kind of dreaming about this like corridor that connects lots of dimensions together, and you see like loads and loads of bizarre worlds, including there's like several like sci-fi ones with like giant machine walkers like roaming around and things like that. And it's just like really, really strikingly visually interesting. And I think in the last episode of series 3, there's the character Isaac faces down this sorcerer who's enslaved this town, and he sort of possessed everyone in the town, and they kind of float through the air and kind of merge into this giant sort of ball thing that, I mean, it's kind of weird, it's hard to describe, but it's really, really well realised when you watch it.
Yeah, one of the good things about the way this show is paced, there's a couple of episodes, like especially the penultimate one in series 3, which are just like wall-to-wall violence from beginning to end. And in quite a, I mean, I say this cautiously as it's not really my cultural area, but in what kind of felt like it might have been quite an anime-influenced way, a very sort of long, lovingly choreographed episode-long violence section.
Yeah, there's clearly a lot of anime influence in the show. In the visual style. But yeah, and obviously, with these kind of very epic fight sequences as well, which are always very entertaining and very watched. Especially there's a big one at the end of each series. Again, similar to Game of Thrones, there's like a big action scene at the end of each series, which usually is very exciting and enjoyable.
Yeah, and as a long-term consumer of Warren Ellis Vision Media, I am enjoying the sensation of his dialogue being read out loud for once.
Yeah, which is unusual.
It mostly works. He has a very sort of distinct cadence to his quips, although he does very wisely give most of the Warren Ellis quips to one character, specifically the main dude, Trevor Belmont, played by Richard Armitage, who does have the right sort of wry British delivery to pull them off.
Yeah, sort of world-weary sarcasm.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I like the dialogue and the sort of self-aware quips, because I do feel like there is a degree this show is kind of doing some quite well-trodden tropes. It's doing a lot of tropes unironically, I would say. So, yeah, like there's an evil army of vampires led by, you guessed it, Dracula, who want to wipe out humanity. And then there's a sorcerer, and there's, a hero who sort of wears furs and has a big sword. I know it's not like breaking new ground in terms of fantasy writing, but the bits of humour and sort of self-awareness, they kind of stopped it being quite so unironic tropes.
Well, I'm assuming that's at least past their motivation in killing Dracula comparatively early and trying to move beyond him.
Yeah, definitely. And which works. Yeah, again, moving beyond unironic tropes.
And also in terms of surprising me and not just going straight down the lines, I'm not going to spoil it because it seems wasteful. We have already spoiled the end of season 2. Sorry, it's a couple of years old. But yeah, there's a twist towards the end of season 3, which I actually am going to not spoil, which actually completely got me. It's a small sort of character twist, but it's quite bleak, and I did not see it coming at all.
Yeah.
Good work, show.
Yeah. There's definitely some surprises along the way, and things that you don't expect as well. Which is, I guess, a testament to the quality of the writing. It's an interesting show. I did really enjoy watching it. Like short, snappy, 25-minute episodes. You can kind of watch 2 in an evening quite easily. It's basically, the whole thing is a Saturday morning cartoon, but for grown-ups. It's really got that kind of like 80s or possibly 90s, like kind of Saturday morning cartoon animated style, but it's got like sex and violence and quite a lot of both in them. Like each episode is kind of like 25 minutes long. So you can see how this could like fit into like a slot in Live and Kicking or something like that. But obviously it was just more shagging and stabbing.
If you ever wanted to imagine what the Saturday morning kids adaptation of Game of Thrones would look like, then...
Yeah, this is exactly it, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, on the scale of good video game adaptations, and admittedly it's not always a particularly illustrious list, I think this might be best at a Detective Pikachu.
Yeah, probably. I think they're trying to do very different things.
But yeah, it's certainly among the best, if not actually the best, video game-based thing I've watched in my life, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the best or better video game adaptations are usually of lesser-known video games, with possibly Detective Pikachu being the obvious exception in that Pokemon obviously is very well known, although they're not doing the straight up Pokemon gotta catch 'em all story. But yeah, I think like Rampage, which came out a couple of years ago, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, was a perfectly serviceable action movie adaptation of a less well known video game. I think the ones that have proved to be problematic in terms of like they've struggled to make the transition from video game to film have been very famous video games that people have a lot of expectations around. So yeah, like Sonic, Doom, Tomb Raider, if they ever do a Metal Gear Solid film.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've actually been playing some Sonic games recently because I got myself a Mega Drive Mini for my birthday to help while away the quarantine. And I can see how those games really don't lend themselves to movies easily. But yeah, saying something is the best video game adaptation I've seen is a tiny bit damning with faint praise, as video game adaptations are not famously very good. But yeah, I was surprised how much I enjoyed this as a sort of premium fun exercise or a sort of novelistic fantasy. I was fully prepared for Warren Ellis to stick to the route he went for in season 1 rather than really spacing things out and going for this slower, more thoughtful pace.
Yeah, there are lots of plot threads that'll be interesting. Some of the ones that were in the earlier ones I hope they'll come back to is they had more about how the church in their sort of alternative vision of medieval Europe with vampires was also quite sort of tyrannical and oppressive, and then you had the heroes were kind of trapped between the church on one side and Dracula on the other. There's not been as much about the church in series 2 or 3, but I assume it's a thread they'll return to.
Yeah.
It's gothy as fuck. It's really excellently sort of violent, quite morbid, quite dark. It's got some beautiful like sort of castles and gothic architecture, and sort of a general sense of kind of gloom and menace hangs over the entire world the show is set in, which is the atmosphere is great.
Yeah, it's I guess a lot of the vampire media I've watched in my life has been things like Buffy, which has made at least some efforts to filter it through a modernity and or knowing irony machine. And as you say, there's relatively little of that here. Like, Trevor Belmont makes a lot of jokes about how weary he is and how much he wishes he could have a drink. But he doesn't, roll his eyes at the leather-clad vampires and go, oh, wearing lots of the leather, are we, for that? He's very, as Alistair said earlier, it's very straightforward in its goth vampire tropes, if you're into that.
Yeah, if you're tired of basically a bit too much irony and self-awareness in your sort of fantasy or sci-fi and would like something that's more straight up, it's dark, it's violent, the whole thing is quite grim, and it's got sort of vampires and stuff in it, and the plot is interesting. It's got an interesting world and rich characterization as well. I suppose now there's been about getting close to sort of like the better part of 25-30 episodes, they have taken their time to build up the characters.
Yeah, and I assume it's doing all right for Netflix as well, since they've commissioned a 4th season, which is actually a rarish move for them outside the really, really successful shows of late.
Yeah.
Them bastards have got into a bit of a habit of axing things after series 2 or 3, so I assume this must be doing pretty well.
Next up this episode, we will be reviewing Tiger King, Murder, Mayhem and Madness, a new true crime documentary from Netflix. For those who haven't seen it, or heard what it's about, the show follows Joe Exotic, an eccentric entertainer and manager of the US's largest private zoo, where he breeds tigers and other big cats, whilst also running a web-based reality TV show, prolific social media appearances, general entertainment around the park, makes music, and runs for political office. He has a very unusual life. The show, however, takes a dark turn when Joe is accused of hiring a hitman to murder Carol Baskin, a rival of Joe's who runs a big cat rescue sanctuary. So we've seen the show on Netflix. Nick, what did you think of it?
Well, remember last episode when I said the platform was maybe not my kind of thing?
Yep.
Yeah, I should probably have maybe saved that line for this episode, because this really isn't my kind of thing. I sort of went into it hoping it was going to be more of a sort of documentary along the lines of Making a Murderer, but we're very much into reality TV territory here. There's very much a hanging tone of, look how outrageous these people are. Oh my god, what are they doing now? Oh my god, there's more gossip. And it's not really a tone that appeals to me in this quantity. There's a certain clickbaity salaciousness of it that was really starting to wear me down by about episode 3 or 4. But yeah, I mean, he's definitely an interesting guy. There's definitely an interesting documentary or expose to be made on him. As you say, some of the more extreme aspects of his life, like the pop music videos, are certainly impressively weird, and there's some cute shots of tiger cubs if you can get past the fact that they're probably being exploited literally as you watch them. Yeah, this is not really a Making a Murderer, true crime, serious documentary. I mean, even Making a Murderer has its slightly trashy moments, but this is definitely, there's lots of, aggressively posed, zooming shots of characters standing in a pose like they're about to star in a video game beat-em-up, and that sort of thing. It's very much just entertaining reality TV, I guess. And yeah, it's just not something I would normally watch. What did you think?
Yeah, so I have a lot of similar feelings about it. There's quite a bit to unpack, as they say in the sort of the summary you just gave. But this show, I think, really wants to be Making a Murderer, and I think it's got a sort of similar thing going on in that they were making a documentary about Joe Exotic and other people, sort of in this weird subculture of America of people who want to own dangerous alpha apex predators, which is just crazy in and of itself. People who keep tigers and lions lions as pets. And they were trying to make this documentary, I guess, and during it, these accusations about him hiring someone to murder Carol Baskin arise. And obviously, similar to how they were making a murderer, and then there was sort of criminal allegations arose during the process. So obviously they stumbled across this breaking story that they document as it goes along. But this show, it's trying to be making a murderer, and it's very much not. Partly because it has, as you say, this quite salacious reality TV tone of just look at the eccentric people being crazy and over the top. But also, I think it's similar, like making a murderer is obviously picking up on like Serial and this kind of explosion of interest in true crime. And this riffs on those things in so many ways. Like the opening sort of title sequence of this show is that kind of a mugshot of Joe Exotic, just as the mugshot was the one for Making a Murderer. It begins with like, you have an incoming call from the somewhere correctional facility, and it just like Serial.
I was gonna say that's Serial.
Yeah, exactly.
To the fucking note.
Yeah, almost. He's like exactly the same. Yeah, and I think there's a few things in this that they kind of really missed that what really worked with, like especially Serial. Serial, I think it really like hinges on, and Making a Murderer as well, this kind of simple question, which is, did this person do the crime or not? And that's kind of the essence of it. Yeah, it's a crime show. It's basically, there was a murder was committed. Is this person accused of it responsible? And what's the evidence? And kind of what makes Serial really work is that it will spend a whole episode convincing you of one thing, like the guy's guilty, and then it'll spend the entire next episode 100% convincing you of the exact opposite. And the kind of point they're getting at is there's a lot of evidence, you can interpret it different ways. It's kind of about the nature of how do we know what is real when there's so much evidence and they all say different things. This show kind of has that, but it doesn't really work so well, partly because it's 7 episodes and they cannon through the crime bit in about the last 2 very, very quickly. And the previous ones are a lot about the characters themselves, and they build them up and you get a sense of their lives, which I suppose is good, but it doesn't give it much space for this, did he do it, did he not do it? And it looks relatively like he did do it. But although that's allegedly, as I say, unless they sue us. But it doesn't have that element of suspense. It doesn't have that back and forth, convincing you, unconvincing you thing. They try to do it, but it doesn't work so well. There's all these kind of very much like, you can bring in these kind of, there's all these other dynamics going on. There's more characters, there's different vectors to it. There's also this kind of like, who do you believe, almost like a cultural element of like, what person represents your view of the world, Carol Baskin or Joe Exotic. There's that level on top of it, which is different to like what the evidence says. So in a way, there's too much going on here for this just to be a true crime show. And at the same time, there's not enough going on here to be a true crime show because there isn't enough crime. It's very odd in that way.
Well, yeah, but obviously I guess they're stuck in that to some level because I think they were basically making a reality TV show for about the first 5 episodes. I mean, I'm sure they've gone back and reformatted it a fair bit after what happened at the end. But obviously they were starting off making this reality show or this documentary, but let's be honest, it was probably going to be quite a reality show-esque documentary about Joe Exotic, and as you say, they just happened to be there when the crime started happening. And, you know, there's probably a clue to that, in that if they just made a reality show about Joe Exotic, I would never, ever, 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 ever have watched it.
No.
I think I just find that it doesn't feel like they're willing to question anything to any substantial degree. It just feels like they're quite annoyingly just presenting me with things and then moving on and presenting me with the next thing. Like it's very interesting in going to people and going, oh, so what do you think about this? What's the gossip? And then one of the handful of men and occasional woman who speak on this show say what their opinion is, and I'm sure they've chosen the best, most salacious soundbite, and then they just move on to the next identical soundbite without interrogating what that person just said. Like there's very little sense they're actually doing much in the way of journalism, and you know, again, very possibly the answer to my point here is, but this isn't investigative journalism, Nick. Fair enough, but that would have been what I want from a show like this.
Yeah, there is that element to it, yeah, definitely. And it's interesting how you say that you would not have watched this if it hadn't been sort of packaged almost as like a true crime thing. I do kind of feel that as well. And one of the big ironies, I think, of this show is that a lot of the characters in it, Joe Exotic especially, and Carol Baskin as well, they've got this huge like reach. There's lots in the show about like social media and how these people, these big social media followings, and they've got these huge reach and impact social media because they have tigers and other big cats, which are rare and interesting, and people like them. So therefore, when you're scrolling through the kind of, you know, million things you see a day on Twitter, a video of someone with a tiger will make you stop scrolling and watch. Because of that tigers are one of the things that do cut through in a world that's so noisy and full of so many signals, that Joe Exotic and Carol Baskin have built up these like followings and things like that. You know, Joe Exotic arguably treats his animals fairly poorly. I mean, I don't know much about his being a zookeeper, but I don't think think it looks like he treats them particularly well. So it's interesting. The show I think doesn't interrogate that enough, which is something I would want to. But also the show does exactly that. This show would not have been as sensational if it didn't have tigers in it, and therefore they could plaster that all over the media coverage, all over the advertising for the show, all over the Netflix home screen to get you to go, oh my god, tigers, and click on that. So this show really benefits from the viral sensation that big cats have. And I feel if this show hadn't been about anything else, it wouldn't have been as successful as it was. Like Serial is successful because it's a great story. It's a relatively mundane murder. It's a murder of one teenage person. It's sad that people get murdered like all the time like that, but it spins this great story out of the uncertainty of did he do it, did he didn't do it. This show doesn't have that great story. I mean, it's got Joe Exotic is obviously a very fascinating character, but the world's full of the sort of fascinating reality TV show people who are willing to expose themselves for attention. If this show didn't have tigers in it, if it had been like a rivalry between like an eccentric truck owner and another eccentric truck company or something like that, if it had been something quite dull, it would never have achieved the level of kind of notoriety that it's got. It's purely because it's got tigers in it.
Well, yeah, but again, that's because if not for the fact that Joe Exotic allegedly turned to crime at the end, then the show would not have been what it is. It would have just been a reality show on some American channel I've never heard of about that tiger guy.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, even taken as what it is, and resisting for a few minutes at least the urge to rake this show over the coals just for being the sort of thing I wouldn't normally watch. I don't know. I found the pacing of it quite punishing. I mean, this might just be again because I don't watch many of these, but yeah, I felt like by about episode 2 or 3, I feel like I've seen a lot of this. I feel like you're just telling me the same things again and again. I mean, like I suppose every episode there's at least a couple of more ridiculous things, but like I feel like there's so many more times I could be told, but that guy's a wanker, oh look, he's yelling at people. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't feel like it really advanced or told a story, at least until the crime started towards the end.
Yeah, and then that crime happens so quickly, it's really hard to follow, like the ins and outs of it. Like it is really oddly paced how like you say, there's a lot of these people being awful and then an awful lot of crime stuff compressed into quite a short period of time.
I mean, some of that's probably practical. I mean, you can tell when you get to the crime stuff at the end, that's when they no longer had full total access to everything. That's when the amount of multiple angles, full access, chatting to everyone, casually hanging around footage just dries up, and you're left with a few chats with a couple of people from the legal side and like some shaky phone cam footage that someone's filmed in their pocket or something.
Yeah, and it leans heavily on interviews with minor players. It's one of the things about the crime plot line. It builds up a lot of characters who aren't really in the early part. Things like Joe Exotic's campaign manager and things like that, who barely features in the first half of the show. And various sort of other people around the park who aren't in it very much when they're in the early part, when they're talking about the animals and Joe's kind of very colourful life. It's kind of where they lean much heavily on that in the crime section.
I think the nadir of it, that's the word I was searching for, was probably episode 3 for me, which was an entire episode focusing on some rumours about whether Carol Baskin had her husband killed.
Yeah.
Again, I should stress, rumours. Yeah, I think that was roughly when my slight dissatisfaction from the show tipped over from, this isn't really my thing, to,
Again, I felt very much with that. They were trying to do a sort of like a serial, which is they're trying to do the thing where they'll convince you of one thing and then convince you of the exact opposite. Another podcast I think that does this exceptionally well, which I think is co-produced by some of the people from Serial, is a podcast called S-Town, which is another one set in about sort of slightly eccentric people in poor rural America. But there's a bit, I won't go too much into this, but basically there's a long-running thing about these relatives of the person who's died, and you kind of get quite a negative image of them. And then they do one whole episode from going through their story from their point of view, and it totally changes how you feel about them, which is the thing Serial does so well. Convince you of something, then convinces you of the opposite. I see what they're trying to do here, because for a lot of people, it's very much built early on, and I was kind of on the side, which is that Joe Exotic does look like a man who mistreats tigers and just mistreats large animals for his own entertainment and enrichment. And Carol Baskin does look like someone who genuinely cares for tigers. I think there's a lot of stuff like, I don't think she's a saint. I think the fact that she seems to rely a lot on unpaid interns is probably not great. And anyway, I'm no expert on zoos, but the show, I think, it starts out going, they're trying to build up, like, Joe is this, like, redneck nutter who's mistreating animals. Carol is, like, the saint. And then they want to do the episode where they're like, oh, no, what if the opposite is true? Like, they want to do the switch that Serial does so well. But it doesn't work because there's really not enough evidence to genuinely... Although there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, I don't think Carol murdered her husband.
I don't honestly have an opinion, but I just found that particular episode to be a particularly fuzzingly padded, really. It's just a bit sort of... By about 5 minutes, you've got to the point where they've gone, did she murder her husband? Could she have done it? And it just never gets beyond that the entire time. And it's barely mentioned again after that episode. In fact, Carol Baskin barely appears after that episode, apart from in the final couple where she has to do some testimony. And it doesn't really change my perspective on anything, really. Yes, it did successfully make me think, okay, maybe this is just the story of two people who both suck a bit instead of just one guy who sucks. But again, the choice to do it in the trashiest way possible probably didn't help. The number of sinister shots of Carol Baskin with sinister music over them. It's not really subtly displaying new shades of nuance to suddenly go from playing saint-like montages of her walking among the cats to playing slow pans on her faces with sinister music. I mean, you haven't really unveiled a subtle new shade of meaning there. You've just started playing sinister music.
Yeah, you just changed how you present the person, which seems very exploitative. That's why it seems like reality TV. I mean, it's hard to argue, like, when does something go from being a true crime documentary into be reality TV, or what the line is. Documentaries and reality TVs, you could argue the same thing. Documentaries are for people who like to read The Guardian and Chinstroke, and reality TV is for people who don't. But if there is a distinction, I think it's one that the documentary should at least try to have some kind of like objective approach. I know it's almost impossible to be objective, but should try and show both sides and present things for the audience to interpret. Whereas a reality TV is like deliberately trying to manipulate the viewer into experiencing something the way a work of fiction would. Like Castlevania obviously attempts to manipulate the viewer by making you think like Dracula is bad and like Trevor Belmont is good. And obviously they're going to go into shades of grey with like, why is Dracula bad? But without going back to review Castlevania, but this isn't cartoon characters. This is people's lives, and they're trying to manipulate you into feeling various specific ways about these people, which is, I don't know. I mean, it was part of the reason why I think the Tiger King has become another shit in the ongoing culture war. You know, and like, again, even like going back to like Serial Making a Murderer, they at least tried to kind of present like the facts and tried to sort of, try to get to some kind of like, can we go through the facts and establish the truth of what happened here, rather than just try and can we manipulate people into feeling a certain way.
Yeah, I think it's not so much about not mentioning the facts as it is just not really caring about presenting a coherent investigation. It's just drawing to any kind of conclusion or working it through in an interesting way. It's just pointing the camera at the interview or the thing someone's saying and then presenting this vague air of, ooh, and what happens next? And I don't know. It's a weird tipping point between documentary and reality TV somewhere, and it's ended up sort of hovering in the middle of it in a way that I don't know whether it satisfied the reality TV audience. It may well have done, and fine. I'm not here to tell you can't have the things you enjoy, but it did not satisfy me.
Yeah, I know there's just a lot of things I wish it could have done differently. Like, I don't think there was really enough about, the central question, which is like, is Joe mistreating the tigers the way he takes them? Like, there's footage of him like taking newborn cubs away from the mother as soon as they're born, because obviously you can only play with a tiger when it's quite young before it becomes very dangerous. But there's not really like any sense to dig into that like objectively. And even like you see Carol Baskin's Big Cat Sanctuary, you hear Joe and some of his people who are on his side of the debate in air quotes saying that like Carol mistreats tigers and doesn't keep them in like proper conditions. And I really felt that like this show would have benefited from bringing in some kind of expert. Could we get someone from like the Bronx Zoo, big famous, we assume like well respected zoos, to say what is the conditions a tiger should be kept in, and also dig more into this kind of like, why do people want to be owned and surrounded by tigers, other than the fact it just makes them look powerful and gets you lots of clicks on social media. I mean, there is a bit of that, but it kind of just gets lost in the lurid sensationalism of it all.
I think that is actually, that is what it was missing, isn't it? I feel like, it just gets very hot for the he said, she said of it, and is no attempt to provide a narrative or rise above it or really go anywhere with that. It's like, well, I've presented what he said, I've presented what she said, I've done it in the most straight-on way possible. If anything, I've fully lent into the emotion of what they both said by playing the appropriate music over it and zooming either in or out of their face accordingly. That's it, I'm done now.
Yeah.
Knock off. Ham sandwiches for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I just left a enduring sort of experience of the whole thing. The whole thing just reminds me of the 2016 American presidential election. You've got basically this totally off-the-wall, bizarre character who is very, very, Joe Exotic, or Donald Trump, who's grabs a lot of attention. He's hard to ignore. His big, loud presence. He does crazy things. People kind of get seduced into the big, fun Joe show rather than ever digging into the truth of what he claims or, the very dodgy things that he's done. I mean, there's a lot we could say about his relationships to sort of the people, around him. There's stuff in the show main character commits suicide, it goes to some dark places. There's not really a lot of interrogation of that, and it's just presented as like, this is what Joe said. And then you've got the other side, which is someone who possibly a flawed character. I don't think, like, again, like to say, like, when they talk about like the amount of work you have to do for free for Carol Baskin before you get anywhere near being paid, doesn't strike me as great. But she's a flawed character, but she is probably the more sensible person in this picture. And any accusation against her just gets covered the sense of he said this, but there's no attempt to interrogate this. There's no attempt to bring in an expert to say, or someone with a more neutral opinion to arbitrate or provide even an extra commentary or context to this. It's just very much presenting he said this, she said that, rather than trying to kind of dig into it more, which is what it needed, yeah.
It's true. There's a reason I stopped reading arguments on the internet, everybody. I don't really care what he said or she said.
Because, yeah, you can't make an informed opinion from this show. You can't really make an informed opinion in the show. You can watch the spectacle. And so many people have seen on the internet, and also people who've spoken to, have walked away with strong emotional opinions, such as Joe's awful or like Carol's awful. It just polarizes people and exploits them. There's no attempt to kind of reach any learning or informed decisions so you can make like the intelligent observations.
It's true. The real answer, everybody, it's not for Joe's awful, it's not for Carol's awful. Everything is awful.
And we're awful for watching it.
And producing another 20 minutes, half an hour of podcast content about it. You're welcome. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Not much fantasy violence in the second one, but plenty in the first one. And, yep, if you want yet more from us, we can be found on the internet at moderatefantasyviolence.com, including all our past episodes and the occasional additional essay, mostly by Alistair. You could also leave a nice review on iTunes if you want to help us grow the show. And please do, thank you very much. You could also now get us on the Spotify platform. We have finally been accepted, probably helped, but we actually started releasing episodes again. So yeah, please do follow us there if that's how you get your podcasts. I'm told by other podcasts that the more people who follow us, the more visible the show is. So even if you're not planning on listening there, feel free to just go on Spotify and click follow, because why not? You don't even have to type a review.
If you want more from us, you can follow us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, and you can find us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can also get more from me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, and you can get more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And yep, I've been Nick Bryan. You can find me on Twitter at NickMB, or you can go to my website at nickbryan.com with more news about my various writing endeavours. And yes, we'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode containing a surprising lack of Netflix. We've got Devs, the new sci-fi show from Alex Garland, which is, I think, on FX in the States and is currently all up on the iPlayer in Britain, so we'll be canoning through that. And we will also be reading Friday, one of the only comics to come out in the Western mainstream in the last month or two, which is a new crime series by Ed Brubaker and Marcos Martin. And if you want to read along on that, you can get that as Pay What You Want from panelsyndicate.com. Okay, and that's been all. Thank you very much for listening. We will see you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.